May 1945. The war was over. At Camp Hearn, Texas, word reached us just before sunset. The guards didn't celebrate. They stood silently by the radio as the BBC announced Germany's surrender. A few of the other POWs cheered, not out of joy, but relief that the dying would stop. I didn't cheer. None of us who had survived the Eastern Front did. I stood alone by the barbed wire fence, staring into the red horizon, unable to feel anything except an odd emptiness. Home was gone. Dresden was a skeleton. My brother never came back from Stalingrad. My father had died under rubble in Hamburg. I was 24, wearing a uniform that now belonged to a memory no one wanted, and living in a place I no longer called a prison. Because the truth is, Camp Hearn didn't feel like prison anymore. It felt like safety, like structure. It felt like a place where the world still made sense. There was meat on the table every day, bread that came with butter, books in the camp library, and no fear of sudden air raids or political executions. One of the guards, a farmer's son from Oklahoma, used to bring us apples from home. Another lent me his copy of Mice and Men. We played soccer in the afternoons, tended a vegetable garden behind the barracks, and at night, I wrote letters to my mother, knowing full well they might never reach her. 3 days after Germany's surrender, a camp administrator handed me a form. It was titled, Repatriation Request. He said I could go home whenever transports were arranged. I looked at the paper for a long time. Then I folded it and placed it under my pillow. I never filled it out. What I couldn't say out loud was this. I didn't want to go home. I wasn't alone. Whispers filled the barracks' quiet conversations at night. Men speaking in hushed German about staying, about what America really was. Not the land of enemy propaganda, but of refrigerators and paved roads, of coffee and jazz, of mail that arrived on time. One man said it best during roll call. They beat us, not just in battle, but in life. No one warned us that the greatest humiliation wouldn't be defeat in combat, but the kindness we received after. The shock wasn't the sound of bombs. It was the silence of dignity. In America, we weren't tortured, starved, or broken. We were fed, housed, given books and structure. We were treated as men, not monsters. And that is what unraveled us. The Geneva Convention had rules, but America did more. Much more. Not because they had to, because they could. Because they had enough. Enough food, enough space, enough belief in their own system to offer it even to their enemies. We, who had followed orders without question, who had seen cities leveled in firestorms, who had watched the Nazi dream crumble into dust, now sat beneath the Texas sky and questioned everything we thought we knew. The war had ended, but something deeper had begun, an internal reckoning. And in the quiet spaces between shifts in the camp laundry or the vegetable garden, many of us began to ask the same question. What if we had been born on the other side? The first time I used a flush toilet in America, I thought it was a mistake. I had been marched off the train in the autumn of 1943, surrounded by strangers in khaki and staring at landscapes so wide, so open, it felt like another planet. Camp Hearn wasn't a fortress of stone or a dungeon underground. It was neat rows of wooden barracks, a canteen, a chapel, a soccer field, and a mess hall larger than any I'd seen, even during officer training in Weimar. When I asked the guard where the latrines were, he pointed to a building with porcelain fixtures and running water. I stared at the chrome handle, pulled it once, and watched clean water swirl away the past. Back home, by 1943, Dresden was already dimming. Electricity was rationed. Soap was a memory. Our bathwater was reused 3 times. I hadn't touched a bar of real soap in over a year. Here in Texas, we were issued soap weekly. We could shower twice, sometimes 3 times a week. There were separate towels, clean ones, each labeled by number. They gave us uniforms, not rags, but new khaki work clothes, soft cotton undershirts, stitched socks. They gave us books, German novels, translations of American classics. A small library stood at the center of camp, staffed by a corporal who had studied at Yale. I remember checking out All Quiet on the Western Front, only to find my own war more surreal than anything in its pages. At night, the lights stayed on, not searchlights, not interrogators' lamps, just warm, stable electric bulbs that didn't flicker. I used to lie awake wondering how they kept the power running 24 hours a day. Later I learned the camp was wired to a municipal grid connected to hydroelectric dams. They had electricity from rivers. The Americans gave us mail, real mail. We could write home, twice a month. The camp printed German-language newsletters so we would stay informed. I remember reading that Berlin was starving while we were planting tomatoes. One article said, Americans were consuming over 3,000 calories a day, even in wartime. I looked down at the tray in front of me. Meat, beans, cabbage, cornbread, coffee. I counted at least 2,500 calories, and that was lunch. What shocked us wasn't just abundance. It was the order, the calm. There was no chaos, no screaming, no drunk guards with twitching fingers. Discipline existed, yes, but it was clean. Boring, humane. One corporal told me once, if we treat you like animals, what does that make us? That line stuck with me more than any battlefield order I'd ever received. The American guards were mostly young men, many the same age as us. Some had brothers overseas. Some had lost fathers at Pearl Harbor. But they didn't spit at us. They didn't mock us. They guarded us like it was a job, nothing personal. On Sundays, some even played soccer with us, then shared cigarettes by the fence. I once asked a guard why he wasn't angry at us. He shrugged and said, "You didn't bomb my house. Hitler did." That was the day I realized these people didn't hate us. They didn't fear us. They had beaten us, cleanly, absolutely, and they had nothing to prove anymore. And that perhaps is what stunned me most. The quiet confidence. The sense that they could win a world war, feed their enemies, and still have enough steel, bread, and books left over to send home. We were supposed to be the master race. We believed America would be decadent, soft, corrupt. But now I was walking through a camp where every schedule ran on time, where the food was measured, the plumbing worked, the soap was wrapped, and the men in charge enforced rules not out of fear, but out of belief in the system itself. Later I learned that Camp Hearn cost more to operate than many entire German towns earned in a year, that the wood for our barracks had come from Oregon, the soap from Cincinnati, the boots from a factory in Illinois. I saw the shipping labels, I read the stamps, the supply chains were invisible and massive. One evening, I found a discarded logistics form pinned to a supply crate. It said, weekly requisition, 12 barracks, 270 men, 300 pounds beef, 180 pounds potatoes, 120 loaves of bread, 45 pounds of coffee. My heart sank. That was for just 1 week. How do you defeat a nation that treats its prisoners with more stability than we gave our own soldiers? How do you win against a country that ships coffee to captives? By winter, the conversations in the barracks began to shift. Less about the Reich, more about America. More about the smell of pine in the Texas wind, the sound of radio jazz in the mess hall, the fact that a POW in a foreign land could fall asleep without fear. We had entered the war convinced of our superiority. But behind the barbed wire, we were slowly coming to understand. We weren't prisoners in a camp. We were guests in a civilization far stronger than we had imagined. It was the first Sunday of November, 1943, when the mess hall served roast beef, thick slices, juicy, steaming. There was mashed potato beside it, a slice of white bread, even a small square of chocolate cake with coffee. I stared at the tray in silence. One of the boys from our barracks, a former artilleryman from Leipzig, whispered, "This must be a mistake. They think we're American." But it wasn't a mistake. It was standard. We had been taught to believe America was decadent, soft, that its people would collapse the moment hardship arrived. Yet now I sat in a dining hall in Texas, a prisoner of war, and I was consuming more meat in one meal than my commanding officer saw in a week back on the Eastern Front. The numbers were staggering. At Camp Hearn, the average daily caloric intake for POWs hovered around 3,200 calories per man. I didn't know the figure then, but I felt it in my body. My uniform began to tighten. My ribs disappeared. My skin regained color. I wrote to my mother, "Don't worry, I am not only alive, I am nourished." Back home, the picture was different. In Berlin, the average civilian was surviving on 1,200 calories per day, and that was before the bombing intensified. My mother traded her wedding ring for a sack of moldy potatoes. My younger sister stood in line for hours to buy bread baked with sawdust filler. One letter I received from a friend on the Eastern Front said their rations had been cut to 300 grams of bread and 1 ladle of turnip soup per day. He died 2 weeks later. In Texas, we lined up 3 times a day. Breakfast was usually eggs, oatmeal, toast, and coffee. Lunch included beef stew, carrots, beans, and fruit. Dinner might be chicken, pasta, or sausage. On Sundays, there was always dessert. Always. Sometimes it was apple pie. Sometimes canned peaches with cream. My father had worked 30 years in a Dresden factory and never tasted canned peaches. One day a fight nearly broke out in the mess hall, not between us, but because one of the new prisoners, just arrived from Tunisia, refused to eat. He sat trembling at the table, refusing the bread. When asked why, he muttered, "It must be drugged. Why would they feed us like this?" That question haunted many of us in the beginning. It didn't make sense. Why would the Americans, who we had fought with rifles and bombs, give us real milk, fresh fruit? Why waste so much food on enemies? The answer was always the same. Because they could. Because their supply lines were intact. Because their farmers weren't under artillery fire. Because their factories ran 24 hours a day. Because their railroads weren't torn apart. Because their ships brought wheat from Kansas and sugar from Louisiana faster than we could steal rations from our own kitchens. In early 1944, one of the guards told me a statistic that didn't seem real. U.S. agriculture had produced more than 120 billion pounds of food in 1943 alone. Enough to feed their population, their allies, and their prisoners. Germany, by contrast, had by then converted zoos into food storage, and the last elephant in Berlin had been slaughtered to feed the army. There was a scene I can never forget. A summer afternoon in 1944, I was working kitchen duty, peeling potatoes. Outside the mess hall, a U.S. Army corporal tossed a half-eaten hamburger into a garbage bin. A young POW next to me, barely 19, froze. He stared at that hamburger like it was gold. He whispered, "My whole family eats less than that in a day." His voice cracked. This country, this enemy, was feeding us more than our own families could find in the ruins of the Reich. Soon, rumors started spreading. POWs were gaining weight. The Red Cross issued reports. Some of us had to be put on restricted diets. I remember laughing when a doctor told me I was too well fed to qualify for work detail. But it wasn't funny. Not really. Because each bite reminded us that the war was not just about territory or ideology. It was about capacity. About a civilization so rich in output that even its waste was more than most nations' wealth. One night, while lying in my bunk, I heard one of the older prisoners say, "If this is how they treat their prisoners, how did they treat their citizens?" No one answered. No one could. Because in our hearts, we already knew. We had thought America was paper-thin, loud, brash, full of slogans. But in the silence of our mess hall, as we chewed soft bread and sipped black coffee, we began to understand. We weren't just losing the war. We had lost the world we thought we knew. I was 25 years old the first time I read Walt Whitman. The book had been donated by a church in Austin. I found it on the third shelf of the Camp Hearn library, wedged between Goethe and a German-language version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. I didn't understand all the words, but the rhythm stayed with me. I had come to this war believing in orders, in obedience, in marching boots and flags. Now I was reading poems about freedom, the individual, the soul of a man as something sacred. What kind of enemy gives you poetry? By 1944, Camp Hearn had become something else. Not a prison, not even a labor camp, but a strange in-between world, a suspended space between defeat and discovery. We began receiving lessons, real ones. A classroom was set up in one of the barracks with chalkboards, maps, and desks. American professors, some in uniform, some volunteers, came to teach us English, mathematics, history, even basic civics. I enrolled in the English course. I thought it would help pass the time. But what I wasn't prepared for was the tone. There was no propaganda, no lectures about why we were wrong or why they were right. Just verbs, vocabulary, idioms, and grammar. We were taught how to express ourselves, to think, to speak, to translate thought into meaning. Back in Germany, education had become a weapon. Books were filtered, questions discouraged. You memorized the answers that kept you safe. Here, in a camp behind barbed wire, I was asked what I thought about democracy, about ethics, about history, not as a list of dates, but as a story of decisions and consequences. They even gave us pencils. One instructor, a retired school teacher from Kansas, used to begin every class with a quote from Voltaire. Think for yourself and let others enjoy the privilege of doing so too. We used to joke that if he'd said that in Leipzig in 1942, he would have disappeared by midnight. What shocked me most wasn't that we were being educated. It was that we were being trusted with ideas, with books, with debate. I once asked one of the guards, "Why do you let us learn so freely?" He answered, "Because the war will end, and when you go home, we want you to bring something better with you." Those words sank deeper than any bullet ever could. And it wasn't just lessons. It was art, music, theater. At Camp Hearn, we had a performance hall. Not large, just a stage, some folding chairs, but it came alive. We put on German plays, read Shakespeare aloud, played Mozart on borrowed violins. The Americans provided the sheet music. They sat in the back and watched. Some clapped. Some just nodded and left quietly. But they came. They showed up. In one performance, I played a minor character in Faust. It was a strange thing, performing Goethe in Texas, wearing a uniform of a lost army, speaking lines about damnation and redemption before an audience of soldiers who had once pointed rifles at me. But it felt right. It felt human. That's what the Americans gave us most of all, humanity. A slow, deliberate dismantling of the machine we had been molded into. They didn't try to break us. They tried to show us that we were already broken and that it was possible to build something else. Some of the men resisted. They called it brainwashing. The Americans want to make us soft, they whispered. But they were the same ones who lined up early for the English classes. The same ones who borrowed Hemingway novels in secret. The same ones who wrote essays about post-war reconstruction as part of camp writing contests. One man I knew, a former SS junior officer, read the Federalist Papers in German, then wept in his bunk, not because of what he read, but because he realized he had never been taught to think beyond the Reich. There was dignity in this strange new world. Not pride, not false honor, but dignity. We weren't being reprogrammed. We were being reintroduced to ourselves without fear, without ideology, without a party watching. And all of this, every book, every blackboard, every hour spent learning English or discussing philosophy, it cost money. Money spent not on defeating us, but on planting seeds. Seeds of doubt, of curiosity, of maybe. Later, I learned that the U.S. Army's Office of the Provost Marshal General had authorized an educational program for German POWs in 1944, that over 20,000 prisoners in camps across the U.S. took part, that textbooks were printed, that teachers were hired, that it was deliberate, structured, designed not just to rehabilitate, but to reimagine what peace could look like. They didn't just beat us with bullets, they educated us, in silence. By the end of 1944, the barracks at Camp Hearn were quieter at night. Fewer arguments, more books open, more journals being kept. We began writing about life after the war, about what kind of Germany we might return to. Some still clung to old loyalties, but many of us, we had seen something else. And we knew, deep down, that even if we went back to our homeland, a part of us would never leave this place. It was in the spring of 1944 that I was first assigned to the cotton fields. The trucks arrived before dawn. We climbed aboard, not under rifles, but under paperwork. The guards didn't shout. They took roll call like factory clerks. Then the gates opened, and we were outside, not escaping, not running, just working. The cotton fields were vast, flat, hot, but they weren't a punishment. They were a privilege. Outside labor was voluntary and in high demand. The reason? We were paid. Not in cash, that would have been a security risk, but in work credit. Points, tokens, 80 cents a day. Enough to buy extra soap, better razors, writing paper, sometimes cigarettes. For a prisoner of war, it was revolutionary. Back in Germany, our own prisoners, the Americans, the British, the Russians, were lucky to be fed. Our guards spat at them, kicked them, laughed at their hunger. Yet here, in America, the enemy paid us to work. The shock was not just financial, it was trust. We were handed tools, shovels, axes, saws, blades, weapons, in the wrong context. And yet, no one panicked. No one locked us in chains. The rules were simple. Do your job, don't run. Few ever tried. Because, truthfully, there was nowhere to run to that was better than where we were. On the cotton fields, we worked alongside Mexican migrant laborers, elderly American farmers, and occasionally African American field hands. There were no speeches, no flags, just quiet endurance under the Sunday. And somehow, it was there in that brutal Texas heat that I first understood the moral absurdity of the Reich's ideology. I was a soldier of the so-called master race, now taking water breaks next to a man from Alabama who had never seen snow. He passed me his canteen. I drank. We both nodded. He said nothing, but I felt the universe shifting. We didn't deserve kindness. We had helped bomb Rotterdam. We had marched into Poland. We had followed an idea that reduced humans to symbols. But now we were being treated, strangely and consistently, as humans again. At the end of each week, our camp sergeant would post the work credits on a board. Some men had earned enough to buy new boots, others to mail parcels back to Germany. Through the Red Cross, some POWs even sent part of their pay to their families, a detail that struck many of us as impossible. America allowed its enemies to support their loved ones back home. I remember staring at the camp store shelf the first time I went in with tokens in hand. It was surreal. Toothpaste, tobacco, ink, chocolate. One could argue this was propaganda. Maybe it was. But even propaganda requires real products, real supply chains, real industrial scale. Back in Berlin, factories had been reduced to rubble. Railway hubs were ash. Coal trains arrived half empty. Our military had begun reclaiming iron from cemetery fences. Our engineers pulled copper wiring from churches for bullets. In contrast, here in Texas, a prisoner of war could choose between 2 brands of shaving cream. How does one process that? One evening, after a long day hauling lumber, I sat on the barrack step next to Ernst, a man from Cologne, who had once served as a supply officer in the Afrika Korps. He held a tin of peanut butter in one hand, studying the label like it was a relic. "Do you know," he said, "I requisitioned supplies for Rommel's entire division in 1942. I couldn't get this much protein into our officers." He paused. "They've beaten us without firing a shot." It wasn't just the food or pay or even the trust. It was the idea that work was not a punishment here. It was a path to dignity. In Nazi Germany, we had learned to fear labor-forced marches, back-breaking quotas, blood mixed with cement. In America, labor came with a sandwich, a break, and the promise that what you earned was yours. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment. America delivered something far beyond, an economic ecosystem within captivity. By late 1944, it's estimated that German POWs provided over 5 million man-days of labor across 46 states, helping with harvests, infrastructure, and rebuilding efforts. And we did it willingly. Not out of loyalty, not out of fear, but because, day by day, America was showing us a version of civilization that functioned with law, with order, with fairness. Not perfection, but stability, predictability, a system so confident in itself that it didn't need to humiliate its enemies to win. When the sun set over the cotton fields, the trucks came back. We climbed aboard, tired, dusty, and strangely content. Back at camp, we cleaned up, counted our tokens, wrote letters. And each night, the unspoken realization deepened. We had been trusted with freedom by the very nation we had tried to destroy. May 1945. The gates opened, not to release us for labor duty, not to escort us to the fields, but to send us home. An officer read the orders aloud. Germany had surrendered. The Reich was no more. The Führer was dead. Berlin had fallen. We were free men, and yet no one moved. I looked around the barracks. Men sat still on their bunks. Some stared at the floor. Others clutched letters from home, trembling. A few cried not from joy, but confusion. We had waited years to be free, and now that the war was over, many of us didn't want to go. I wish I could say it was courage that kept us frozen, or pride, but it wasn't. It was fear. Fear of going back to a place that no longer existed. Letters had come in waves throughout the winter. Some were returned with black crosses. Others described scenes of unimaginable ruin. Cities reduced to skeletons, mothers sleeping in coal cellars, children dying from pneumonia in collapsed buildings. One man's wife wrote, "There is no home anymore, only ashes and silence." We weren't returning to a homeland. We were returning to a graveyard. And so, the irony unfolded before us. The enemy we had fought was now the only place we felt safe. At Camp Hearn, we had beds, food, soap, books. We had structure, and above all, we had dignity. We were addressed by name, given choices, offered music, lectures, games. We had lived as human beings. Back in Germany, former soldiers were now beggars. Veterans returned to find their homes occupied, their families scattered. Food was rationed, clothing was scarce, heat was non-existent. Black markets thrived, hospitals were overwhelmed. In one report, the average calorie consumption in Germany by mid-1945 had dropped to under 1,000 calories per day. We, the prisoners, were healthier than the citizens we had left behind. Some begged to stay, literally. I remember standing in line as a fellow POW, Hans, stepped forward with trembling hands and asked the officer, "Sir, can I stay? I'll work. I'll sweep the floor. Anything." The officer looked at him confused. "But you're free to go," he said. Hans nodded slowly. "That's what I'm afraid of." Others wrote letters to the guards, requesting sponsorship. Some filed formal applications for immigration. A few even refused repatriation outright, citing psychological hardship or lack of home. The numbers were not small. By 1946, over 5,000 German POWs had requested to stay in the United States. Many more would return years later as immigrants, engineers, professors, farmers, rebuilding not the Reich, but their lives under a different flag. I remember the last night before our train was scheduled. We held no celebration, no farewell party. The camp was quiet, heavier than usual. The guards passed through the barracks, offering one last cigarette, a final handshake. Some avoided eye contact, others offered soft smiles. But everyone understood what was unspoken. This wasn't just a departure. It was the end of a life we never expected but had come to trust. As I stepped aboard the train, I turned back one last time. The sun was rising over the edge of the compound. The barbed wire glowed orange in the morning light. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't looking at a prison. I was looking at the only stable home I had known in years. The train began to move. Some men waved. Others stayed silent. I clutched a notebook in my lap filled with English phrases, sketches of the camp, poetry I had copied from the library. It was all I could take with me. That, and a truth I would never forget. We did not lose to America's weapons. We lost to its values. They had fed us more than we had fed our own men, paid us, educated us, given us laughter, music, and purpose. We had tried to destroy their world, and in return, they let us live in it for a time with grace we did not deserve. When I arrived in Frankfurt, the train station was a ruin. Smoke still drifted through the streets. The silence was heavy. The air stank of rot and desperation. I stepped onto the platform, a free man in a fallen land, and I knew the war had ended, but the reckoning was just beginning. I never returned to Camp Hearn, not physically, but in my mind, I never left it. Years passed. I became a teacher in Stuttgart. I married a widow who had lost her brother at Monte Cassino. We had 2 sons. I taught them English before they learned French. I told them the war was a mistake, but I never told them what I had seen behind the wire. Not fully, not at first. How could I explain it? That the most transformative experience of my life came not from a battlefield, but from being captured by the enemy? That inside the fences of a prison camp in Texas, I had learned what it meant to be a man? In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of VJ Day, I finally spoke. There was a small gathering at a veterans museum in Heidelberg. I was asked to speak on behalf of former POWs. Most declined. I didn't. I stepped to the microphone and said, "They call us the defeated. But defeat, I have learned, is not the worst thing that can happen to a man. Hate Island, Ignorance Island, Blindness Island. I was defeated, but in that defeat, I saw a civilization greater than victory. A place where prisoners were treated as men. A nation that fought with bullets, yes, but also with bread and books and belief." I paused, then added quietly, "They didn't just win the war, they won me." There was silence, and then applause. But it wasn't for me. It was for something else. Something I still carry, like a letter never sent. I am old now. My sons have families. They ask me sometimes about those years. I tell them fragments, that I learned to weld in Texas, that I first read Steinbeck behind barbed wire, that a corporal from Arkansas once shared his lunch with me on a hot day in July. What I don't say is this: I was broken when I arrived in that camp, full of pride, doctrine, obedience. But America disarmed me, not with force, but with function, with dignity. With a cafeteria that never ran out of milk, with a classroom that asked what I thought, not what I was told. I saw trains run on time without fear. I saw strangers help each other without question. I saw a nation capable of feeding not just its soldiers, but its enemies. That kind of abundance is more than physical. It's moral. In Tokyo, the generals called it surrender. In Berlin, they called it shame. But for us, for those of us who lived it, it was something else. It was revelation. We had tried to conquer the world by command, but America had built something far more dangerous, a way of life people didn't want to leave. Even now, I sometimes dream in English, not the language of orders, but of options, of books, of ordinary kindness. They won the war not just with tanks, or planes, or code breakers, but with a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, with soap, with lights that stayed on through the night, with a belief in the power of free men to rebuild even their enemies. And that is how I remember them. Not with banners or parades, but with quiet dignity, a loaf of white bread, a pencil, and the memory of a place called America.